Tell me if this sounds familiar. You've got all the elements of your track sorted, they all work together, you're happy with the arrangement and you really like the overall feel of your track, but you can't quite get it to sound like the tracks you hear on the radio. So what is it that you're missing? Well, in this video, we're going to be talking about the last sort of 20 to 30% of the mixing process. And as an example of this, here is a draft mix, which I think most people can get to. And I'm going to show you how to take your mixes from this There are 6 areas that we will be addressing: drums, bass, leads, vocals, depth, and volume balancing. First up, let's look at the drums. So one mistake that us producers sometimes make is having drums that are too floppy with too much reverb on them. It may depend on the genre of the track, but in most forms of electronic music, you will likely need to tighten up the drums, and this really helps create more space in your mix for other elements. The most important thing is to shorten the kick as much as you can without it sounding naff. So let's do the kick first, then we'll do the snare. So first off, make sure you have a fade to prevent clicks, and then play it and shorten the kick as you do. Not too much, otherwise it will start to sound weak, but it's surprising how much you can remove and it still do its job. Remember, by doing this, we are creating more space in the mix for our other elements. I also added a sharp low boost at 50 Hz to give it a slight bass boost and therefore more warmth, and a boost to 5K to make it a little more present in the mix. I also added a small amount of compression. It's very slightly changing the balance between the snap or the attack of the kick and the tail of the kick, effectively making the kick ever so slightly punchier. It is very subtle, but if you listen to the tail of the kick get quieter when the compressor is active, you can hear the difference. Finally, I use a free plugin which you can get from Plugin Alliance made by Brainworks called BX Subfilter. I set the tight punch to 65 Hz with a slight low end boost, and I just turned it down a bit to rebalance it. So onto the snare or clap. Now, in a house track like this, it's not so necessary to tighten the clap, depending on the sample you use, of course. But in a drum and bass track, I'd be much more inclined to tighten the snare as much as possible, as it has way more impact on the mix. If you think it needs tightening, then at least try it. This clap is absolutely fine, it just has slightly too much reverb on, which of course sounds lovely on its own, but has a negative impact on the overall mix. So all that reverb is really doing is making the mix messier. And you really want the snare or clap sounding up front in the mix, and reverb will do the opposite of that. Also, I layered it with another clap sound to help it be a bit more present in the mix. So altogether sounding good, but obviously on its own that's not enough, so let's look at the bass. Having a tight low end in your mix is imperative to getting a good overall mix. Other than sidechaining, which I'm going to presume you have already done by this stage in the project, there are 2 main things we can do with the bass. So just like with the drums, we can tighten it up. Inside this instrument, called Vital by the way, and is a completely free synth that is quite frankly amazing, you should definitely get it. We'll just tweak the envelope to lessen the tail, which is mostly controlled by the release, and depending on the sound you may want to play with the decay and sustain to further tighten it up. One other thing, which is not always necessary but sometimes is absolutely vital, is to add a sub-bass layer to the bass line. The sub bass in your mixes, it needs to be present, but not overpowering. And most importantly, it needs to be consistent. This is our current bass line. You can hear it does not really have much in the way of sub-frequencies, and those that are present are not at all consistent. So our best option here is to layer it with a dedicated sub-bass. To get this to work, we first need to remove any sub-bass frequencies from the existing bass line, just so our new sub-bass layer has the space in the frequency range. I've already created a sub-bass playing the same pattern as the bass line. Just like the original bass line, this must be sidechained using the kick, and then just add it in and balance the volume. Apart from making the mix better and more consistent, it also adds some nice warmth to the chorus sections of the track. So moving on to the leads, I won't spend long on this as it's very similar to the bass. Sweaty armpits, nice. Very similar to the bass, we tighten the sound by lessening the release of the synth and the sustain and decay if needed. We'll also layer another synth with it to help enhance the texture and make it sound fuller. Again, this may or may not be needed, it will depend on your mix. I then do exactly the same with the piano, tighten it up by lessening the reverb and release of the instrument. I also added another piano layer to the mix, playing just the bass notes. This has no effect on the chorus, but it adds some organic sounding bass to the breakdown sections of the track, which again improves the overall warmth of the mix.
Feeling like I'm on the edge, wanna hide. Feeling like I'm on the edge, wanna hide inside my head.
Now let's look at the vocals. So just a few small tweaks here to the dual compressors, just lowering the threshold slightly so the dynamics of the vocal are more compressed. I also add some attack to the second compressor to bring a bit of life into the vocals, very similar to what we did with the kick. So it lets a bit of the vocal through before turning the vocal down. This helps the vocal sound a bit more punchy.
Going over and over you. Going over and over you. I'm going over and over.
But the most significant change is ditching the old reverb send and using a dedicated reverb plugin. The one I use is actually called Realm, I think that's how it's pronounced, by Native Instruments. It was recommended by a friend. It's not free, though not very expensive, and is personally, in my opinion, worth every single penny. It adds a really pleasing depth to the vocal.
Going over and over you. I'm going over and over you.
Also, the delay is just a touch too much, so we'll lower the mix to 5.5% for both left and right channels. That's the vocal tweaked. Now let's talk about depth in your mixes. So reverb and delay are wonderful effects, but used too much can leave you with a confused and messy sounding mix. One of the biggest differences between this mix is the rebalancing of reverb and delay, which probably accounts for about 30% of the transformation from draft mix to final mix. You'll get another 30% from tightening all of the sounds, which we've discussed, and then the remaining 40% from sort of volume balancing and little tweaks like subtle EQ changes, stereo widening on some elements, and so on. So we have lessened much of the reverb already as we have gone through, but Understand that you want to be reasonably sparing with reverb in your mixes. This means that when you have an element you do want to put more reverb on, you can do so without all the combined reverb in the track just becoming a big mess. There is also a psychoacoustic effect of adding reverb, which you can use to make the main element of your track sound bigger and larger than life. Now in this track, the main element is of course the vocal, but this can also apply to leads or bass if those are the main elements of your track. So when I add larger amounts of reverb to the vocal than the rest of the mix, or in comparison to the rest of the mix, it makes the vocal seem like it's sat further back in the mix, and as it's further back, I can turn it up relative to the rest of the mix. That way it still stays balanced, but is now louder and has even more power than it did before I added the reverb. In other words, the more reverb you have on one element, the louder you can have it in the mix. Obviously, balance still has to be maintained, so you don't want to take this too far, but this is one reason producers manage to get such big vocals in their tracks. It's not magic, it's psychoacoustic. So the last 40% of the transformation is all down to getting the right levels and making final little tweaks. Volume levels being the most important, as it can make or break your mix. Now you can guess what those levels are, or you can find a similar track to yours in the same genre and use that as a guide to set the volume levels of the elements of your mix. This is by far the easiest way to get the levels right. Now for this track, I used a track by David Guetta and Little Mix called Heartbreak Anthem, as it's kind of similar and has much of the same vibe and character. So there are two rules you must follow when using reference tracks in order to be successful. The first is you must bring the reference track into your project so you can A/B comparison between the two. You need to be able to instantly switch. There can be no gap between when you hear your track playing and the reference track when you switch. How I do it is I bring the track in, line up the start of the chorus with the start of my chorus, mute the reference track, and then I can simply switch between the two by pressing the solo button on the reference track. Sorry I can't play it as I don't want to get copyright strikes, but you get the idea. It's the same way I've been switching between the draft mix and the final mix. The second rule is you must volume match the reference track to the track you are working on. If you don't, then you are going to make inaccurate decisions. When you match the volume, don't focus just on one element of the mix like the kick, focus on the overall volume level and try to match them as evenly as possible. This will give you a much clearer idea of what you need to change in your mix to get the same volume levels. Of course, there are many small volume adjustments and minor tweaks that are made to the mix over time, but 90% of what took this mix from draft to final are all of the things that we have discussed so far. And it took us from this quite the transformation. Now, of course, this is just scratching the surface. There is a lot of work just to get your tracks to the draft stage. So if you really want to get better in all areas of music production, there is no better way than to follow one of our genre-specific start-to-finish tutorials, because you learn not only about mixing, but you'll learn how to pick the right elements. So mixing becomes easier in the first place. You'll learn about arrangement skills, processing skills, drum programming, vocal recording and processing, how to make your own chord progressions and melodies, and like a bucket load of other important skills. So click the first link in the description and check them out. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the thumbs up and remember to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.